This is Leafs Morning Take with Nick Alberga and Jay Rosehill.
Now we've got a fight started here right off the bat with Rosehill.
30 minutes of live, non-stop Leafs talk starts now.
What a return for Austin Matthews. What a response for the Toronto Maple Leafs following that stinker, absolute stinker against the Columbus Blue Jackets on Saturday. They fire back with a 5-2 win on Wednesday night against Chicago, presented by PointsBet Canada and Montana's. It's a Thursday edition of Leafs Morning Take. Nick Alberga with you, as you can see, flying solo for today's episode. Jay's working the firefighting job, but don't fret. 3 Hits with Rosie makes a triumphant return to the show coming up in about 5 minutes from now. Again, can only wonder what Rosie's going to bring to the table, especially when you add the old trade deadline into the conversation. Where's Rosie going to steer the conversation? Find out, I should say, in about 5 minutes from now. Remember to subscribe, tap that like button, leave us a review wherever you're checking us out. And don't forget to visit theleafsnation.com for the very latest on all things Toronto Maple Leafs. In addition to that, as you all know by now, we're in the process of migrating over to our very own YouTube page. You see it on your screen right now, courtesy producer Alex. Make sure to subscribe to the Leafs Nation 401, the Leafs Nation 401, where you can find all our content over at YouTube. And eventually we're going to be migrating over and doing the live show from that page as well. So make sure to like, subscribe, check out some of our interviews. We interviewed Matthew Nyes yesterday. You see the Friedman interview up there. We had Darren Dreger on earlier this week. Lots of fire behind this account right now. So at the Leafs Nation 401, thoughts, comments, questions, or concerns, drop us a line in the chat down below here on YouTube, and we'll get to that later on in the show. Meantime, since we had Matthew Nyes on the show yesterday, I thought now's as good as ever to talk some prospects. Obviously, with the trade deadline roughly 2 weeks away, it's going to be 2 weeks coming up tomorrow. I can't believe it's on a Friday this year, by the way, which is tremendous theater, if you ask me. It's primarily and usually on Mondays, but this year it'll be on a Friday. And for the prospect talk, I thought who better? He's been doing phenomenal work over at theleafsnation.com, also with the Lamenting the Leafs podcast, so make sure to check that out. He's the host of that podcast. Nick Richards going to stop by in about 10 minutes or so. We're going to break down the scope on the Maple Leafs farm, what to look forward to, should they trade Nyes. Fraser Minton's had a really good year topping the Emila. There's a lot of avenues we can go with Nick. We're going to get his thoughts on this Leaf season thus far, what he likes, what he doesn't like. Of course, Justin Hull, a healthy scratch last night. And I don't know, Connor Timmins looked pretty damn good to me, but certainly a lot of conversations as per usual in Leafsland, I should say. But for now, we're going to hop over the boards. I like that beatdown on Bay Street, and that's exactly what it was. And it's always good to get hyped as somebody who covers the Leafs and watches the Leafs when they beat a shitty-ass team. That's what happened last night. They took care of business, and I find myself commending this team when they beat bad hockey teams. But obviously, and we talked about this on the show yesterday, you can't not get boosted by the return of Austin Matthews, who I thought was tremendous. They put up the graphic yesterday, too, on the broadcast, what he does in like the first game back following missing significant time or missing an injury. I think the way they mapped it out was great too. Misses 3 weeks or 5 games, which in the grand scheme of 82 is not the worst thing in the world. So he's refreshed, he's rejuvenated. It gets Nylander going, another 3-point night for him. Nylander hits 30 goals for the third time in his career. Matthews was good with 1-1. Sandin gets 1-1. Everybody chipped in, and certainly the way that game started, I'm like, here we go again. It's going to be a 9-8 game. Nylander scores, and the response by Lafferty, and then the Leafs sort of take over there in the first period. Then the second period happens. You're like, oh no, I just saw this movie on Saturday against Columbus. But I think you have to give Toronto a lot of credit for figuring that out in the second, saying, you know what, we're not doing this again. We're going to stomp our foot down. We're going to put it down, and we're going to take control of this game. And I thought after that, they did. Not quite the homecoming I think Peter Mrazek expected, but I think when he was dealt to Chicago, he knew this was coming. It's been a tough season for that team. So all in all, thumbs up for me, 2 thumbs up when it comes to the Leafs in that 5-2 victory. But again, you can't get too hyped about it. They took care of business against an inferior opponent in a back-to-back who was just destroyed by Montreal on Tuesday 4-0, and they combo that up with a 5-2 game. Not to mention the Leafs will be at the UC in Chicago coming up on Sunday. So hopefully they can go for the season sweep. And the other thing I would say is Patrick Kane. It seems like this conversation has really picked up in the last 48 hours, and he's been linked to Toronto pretty much ever since the New York Rangers were out of the equation because they acquired Vladimir Tarasenko. The Rangers, by the way, have won 6 in a row, 3-0 with Tarasenko and Mikkola in the lineup. But should the Leafs go after Patrick Kane is the big-time question. And I said this on the show yesterday. When you have the opportunity to acquire a stud like that, a future Hall of Famer, and most importantly, he's clutch in the Stanley Cup playoffs, at the very least, you have to see A, what it would take, and B, if he's even interested in being a Toronto Maple Leaf. So, that was the biggest flex for me, is that they pumped Chicago with Patrick Kane in first person to watch Matthews, to watch Nylander. What a filthy pass by Mitch Marner in the first period. It's so unfortunate. In a nutshell, that's Alex Kerfoot's career as a Maple Leaf, by the way. He goes offside, ruins the moment. That was absolute filth by Mitch Marner. But a firsthand scope, I thought Patrick Kane got of what life could be like as a member of the Toronto Maple Leafs. So at the very least, you have to think they're thinking about it. And of course, they're going to mull that over as the days go by here on Leafs Morning Take. So happy and content with that 5-2 victory for the Leafs. Back in action coming up on Saturday against Montreal. They're hosting them for the first time this season. And yes, the Habs have won the first 2 meetings of 4 in this campaign because life just doesn't make sense sometimes. And Montreal, I don't care who's on the roster, they always seem to play up to the Leafs, and the Leafs sometimes play down to that team. So back-to-back coming up this weekend, home to Montreal, at Chicago on Sunday. But without further ado, again, 5 minutes away from Nick Richard hopping on for some prospect talk. Here is Jay Rosehill, 3 Hits with Rosie.
Welcome back, 3 Hits with Rosie. It's been a while. How you doing? We just saw the Maple Leafs crash the Chicago Blackhawks in style. Finally, it's nice to see. I mean, that's how it looks when you play those bottom feeder teams and you are the dominant, clearly better team. That's how it looks. You're playing with poise. You're playing with confidence. You're in control the entire time. The Leafs have really had trouble doing that, and we constantly go over what are the reasons for that. Do they not show up with effort? Do they not prepare properly? Is it a mental block where they think this is a foregone conclusion? Do they think they're better than they are? Whatever the reasons are, when you're better than a team, you can get to that point where they were tonight, where it feels like they're in cruise control, and the only way to do it is to show up, put in the effort, prepare like it's a tough game. There's no easy games in the NHL, and you got to put in the effort and you got to do everything right. And when you do so, you can run through a team like they did tonight. Hopefully, they're learning their lessons and we can put all this crap behind us between us talking about them losing to terrible teams. I know Columbus was just a little while ago, but hopefully we're done talking about that garbage. This game, I was most impressed by the fact that they spread out their offense. They got a little bit from the D. They spread it around the forwards. Everyone was chipping in. That's a sign of a solid team, a winning team that can get the job done in all different scenarios when they're getting help from everyone. It wasn't just one guy getting hot and winning the game on his own shoulders. That's another positive to me. 2, they're talking about Justin Holl coming back in tomorrow or next game, and does Connor Timmins stay in and whatnot? I mean, he's got what, 11, 12 points in X amount of, he's got tons of points in a short amount of games. He's been out of the lineup a little bit. What's so special about Justin Holl where he just can't come out of the lineup? I can't wrap my head around it. It's been all year long. I couldn't figure out why he wasn't, getting sat down, especially at the beginning of the year when they were struggling with him. He was the guy who was causing a lot of problems out there. His mistakes were amplified constantly, and he was just a constant in the lineup. Now all of a sudden he comes out. It was a bit of a story. Leafs have a game like that. Connor Timmins chips in, scoring a goal, having a solid game. And, why not just leave Hall in the press box? He's not rotting there. He hasn't even been there all year. Let him sit for a minute and see if we can invigorate himself. And when he comes back in, he's going to have to do better. It's a tough league to stay in. And if you're not cutting the cheese, man, then there's consequences. And he's had 0 this year. So it's nice to see other people jump in. It just shows the depth of the back end, which is, number 3, why I don't think we need to, work too hard or sell the farm to help out our back end. We're quite deep back there. I'm more of a bottom 6 guy where we can add. And I don't want to sell the farm to try to get, some additions. I especially don't want to sell the farm to get a Patrick Kane type character to jump into the top 2 lines, mess everything up, rub guys the wrong way, maybe step on people's toes, maybe mix up the mojo going on between this guy and that guy, and the way everything's rocking right now, I really don't think that's our problem. And to think to myself to trade like a Matthew Nyes to get him just kind of makes me ill. After talking to him today or the other day on the interview and watching his highlights and watching some of his play, I just get more and more impressed with the guy. And there's certain players that step into the league and you can't really figure out, why is this guy just mature beyond his years? How has he gotten to this point where he's just like this man child who's just able to handle all of these things coming your way that you need to be able to handle to be, a big step to the NHL. And that guy just seems to have it in spades, man. I mean, I think about, maybe he wins a national championship here this year at Minnesota. Maybe he wins the Hobey Baker. Then maybe he signs a contract with the Toronto Maple Leafs, gets a few games under his belt. I think he'd probably fit well on the third line. What if he elevates the play of like Kerfoot or Engvall or someone like that, and he just really complements those guys well? A player of that caliber can really help out some guys on his line mates. All of a sudden, you've got such a well-rounded forward group. You didn't have to give anyone away or sell anything, and this guy could really make a big difference. I think he's that type of a player, and the thought of getting rid of him for some kind of a rental just makes me a little bit ill. So I hope that does not happen, but hey, only time's going to tell. The trade deadline's ticking down, and we love breaking it down, but in the meantime, the Leafs are chipping off points like they're supposed to. Thanks for coming. Back to you, Nick.
Wow, surprise, surprise. A very optimistic Jay Rosehill once again. He'll be back in the saddle coming up on Friday. And unquestionably, we will debate, is it time for a new goal song in Toronto? It's games like last night. I'm like, holy fuck, it is just time. Anyways, Montanus is bringing back the viewing party with daily deals in 2023. We're giving away a $100 gift card coming up tomorrow, courtesy our friends over at Montanus. So all you got to do is like the post that producer Alex is going to put on the screen momentarily. Follow at Montana's BBQ and TLNDC on social media. Tag them as well with a photo of you and your crew as well. And you can also just do the same thing and tag your friends in the post. So make sure to do that too. We have a whole explanation over at Instagram, over at Twitter, how you can get into the mix when it comes to the $100 gift card at Montana. So make sure to check that out because the draw date, I believe, ends today. So if you want to get in the mix for that gift card, $100 at Montana's. That's a lot of drinks. That's a lot of ribs. It's a lot of chicken wings, whatever you want to partake in over at Montana's. You see there a lot of phenomenal deals. Speaking of which, we had Matthew Nyes, as mentioned on yesterday. It just brought to my head the need for some prospect talk on this podcast as we get closer and closer. Obviously, number one, to the Stanley Cup playoffs, but number two, most importantly, the trade deadline on March 3rd. I'm so happy to be joined today by Nick Richard from theleafsnation.com, obviously putting out some fantastic material on a daily basis, and also the Lamenting the Leafs podcast. What's up, Nick?
Hey, man. How's it going?
Not too bad. Obviously, I want to get into the conversation about some of the prospects with this organization, but let's start with last night's game. I thought you had a funny tweet following the game. It's just so weird when they beat a shit team, eh?
Yeah, well, they've had more than their fair share of struggles with those inferior teams, but I thought they really took care of business last night. It was good to see. And, everyone's talking about the offensive explosion, and it was nice to see Matthews get back on the board in his first game back. But what really stood out to me was his play low in his own defensive zone. It's just it separates him from the rest of the forwards on this team and a lot of the forwards around the league. He made a handful of plays early on in that game that just broke things up down low in his own end and quickly pushed play up the other way. It was really nice to have him back and great to see the Leafs take care of business against a bad team.
Here's an analogy for you. It's not watching Matthews play for like 5 games, like comparable to like not eating your favorite pizza for a long period of time. Like you forget what you're missing. And then, dude, I turned the game on last night. I'm like, holy crap, this guy's just so good at hockey. Like it was so good to see him back out there.
Yeah, and I hope that like no one in Leafs Nation has really taken this guy for granted, but it kind of hits you when you go for a few games without him in the lineup. It's a really stark contrast to when he's in there. You take one of the top 3 to 5 players in the world out of your lineup, you're going to feel it. But I thought he was a noticeable player in the game against the Blackhawks last night and played a big part in coming away with that nice tidy win.
Where do you stand in the Patrick Kane conversation? Because I've been on record in saying, like, you have an opportunity to go after Patrick Kane. You at least invite that conversation, if you will. Obviously, he hasn't had a great season, but he had 92 points last year. Like, he's still a really good player. And to me, it's very comparable to, like, Claude Giroux last year, where he really struggled in Philadelphia, gets dealt, and he becomes Claude Giroux again. What's your feel on Patrick Kane and maybe his sort of parallels to being a Toronto Maple Leaf here?
Well, I think Kyle Dubas and his staff wouldn't be doing their due diligence if they weren't at least checking in and kind of investigating where his head is at in terms of his preferred destinations, checking in with Kyle Davidson and seeing exactly what it's going to cost to acquire a Patrick Kane. I'm just not sure that he is the ideal fit for what the Leafs are looking for right now. I think their priorities will probably be elsewhere, but he's the kind of player that, if he's controlling his market, his destination, all of
Hmm.
that, and the acquisition cost isn't overly high, that's the kind of player you maybe circle back on after you've taken care of your primary objectives ahead of the deadline. As you said, it's Patrick Kane we're talking about. Yeah, he's had a down year, but this is a guy. He had 92 points last year. He's headed for the Hall of Fame. The bottom line. So I think the chance that there's still something left in the tank there is definitely worth investigating. I just wouldn't be making him my primary objective.
That's the uniqueness as well with this scenario. Again, very similar to Claude Giroux, where Patrick Kane pretty much is going to call his shot, right?
Yeah.
Giroux wanted to go to Florida, maybe even Colorado. We all know right now he didn't hide his feelings, Patrick Kane, when it came to the New York
Yeah.
Rangers. So he's got to turn his focus. So I'm right there with you on that conversation. So you spoke about deadline needs and wants. I've been saying for a couple of days, like, I think in a perfect world, obviously you'd love to add a D and a forward, but to me, I think what they should hunt is like an Arturi Lehkonen type, who really I think
Yeah.
felt and help put Colorado over the type and over the top, I should say. And ultimately, like an Ivan Barbashev type player comes to mind.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah. Barbashev, as of now, would be one of my preferred targets for the Leafs to be going after.
yeah,
I think you kind of get away from that, maybe those sky high prices at the top of the market when you're talking about those guys like Timo Meyer, even Ryan O'Reilly. I think Barbashev is a player who could probably be had for less, and he's a very versatile piece.
hmm,
He gives the Leafs something that they don't really have a whole lot of in their forward group, especially in terms of grit and physicality. And he's able to play all three forward positions. He can kind of solidify that center depth if need be. But he's that tweener guy who can kind of fit in the middle six and sort of gel with a lot of different types of players. Barbashev is definitely a player I'd be interested in the Leafs targeting ahead of the deadline.
What's your read on Matthew Nyes? Obviously, we had him on the podcast yesterday. Very professional, very put together. Didn't
Yeah.
really give away too much in terms of what's ahead for his future. Obviously, focusing right now on the college and Hobie Baker, and obviously potentially winning the Frozen Four. But like, if you're Kyle Dubas, would anything out there, any pieces out there, admire, entice you to potentially include Nyes in a deal?
The only one for me would be Timo Meyer, and even
Yeah.
then, without any kind of certainty in terms of his future and how long you're going to be able to retain him. I know he's got that massive qualifying offer he's
Hmm.
due this summer, so that would be a really tricky thing for Dubas and his staff to navigate. Um, Meyer would be the only player that I would even remotely consider moving Nyes for. This organization has struggled over the last number of years to inject that cheap homegrown talent
Yeah.
into their lineup. And for a team that's always right at that cap ceiling, you need those cheap contributors. You need those guys that are going to come in and provide something without straining your salary cap picture. And when you've got a player like Matthew Nyes, he's almost like a ready-made asset. I'm not saying that he's going to step in and be an immediate answer for the top six or anything like that, but there's just so many pro-level traits to his game. He's just so close to being able to, like, for example, I think he could step in on the fourth line tomorrow and contribute no problem on the fourth line and be, a positive, impactful piece on that unit. And then the ceiling for him to grow into something more than that is obviously there as well. So if you're talking about moving off of a player like that, I think you've got to be really, really careful when doing that. And it would have to be for an impact piece that you're going to have in your lineup for the foreseeable future, like a guy like Meyer, if you are able to work out that extension.
So let me ask you this. If you're Matthew Nyes, and obviously this has to go in the back of your mind if you're Nyes, but like how concerned are you that you're like the next Nick Robertson, right? Because as you mentioned, like that's been a struggle with this organization is
Yeah.
maturing prospects. And maybe that's why I've been so high on Pontus Holmberg this year. I know everybody in the prospect community has been hyping this guy up for a couple years, but he's really come to the forefront. He's been really, really consistent. But from the Nyes department, I wonder if that's a bit of a reservation on their part, thinking, hey, like this is what happened with Nick Robertson. Not to say that Robertson's lost or anything, but
Yeah. I think they're very different situations because you look at Robertson and what makes him successful. You look back to that massive year he had in Peterborough before turning pro. He's kind of that undersized, wiry sniper who's
Mhm.
got a relentless motor, maybe a little bit too relentless at times. I think you can make the argument that Robertson has maybe played a little bit too fast in the early part of his pro career, kind of just chasing things around. Whereas Nyes has that physical makeup and that base of skills that almost presents a clearer projection to the NHL. I think, in terms of overall upside, they're probably pretty similar players, but I think when you're talking about the floor of what they're going to be able to contribute at the NHL level, Nyes is, a far safer, clearer projection who's got kind of a clearer path to being an NHL player.
So who are some of the guys to look out for? Obviously, it is deadline time. They're going to have to attach a couple prospects into the conversation. Just looking at some of your
Yeah.
lists that you put forward, obviously, Robertson's still in the mix there, but he's done for the year. Nyes goes without saying is their top prospect, top in the MLA. Of course, the defenseman Fraser Minton. You've been high on this year too.
Yeah, I think Minton was a bit of a surprise pick last year when the Leafs grabbed him at 38th overall. Just looking at all the public draft boards and places like Elite Prospects, Dauber Prospects, etc. This is a guy who was probably forecasted more as like a third, maybe fourth round pick, but the Leafs obviously saw something in him that they really liked, and I think it kind of represented a bit of a similar strategy or similar kind of pick to what they did with Matthew Nyes in terms of this is a guy who's got that top six upside, but also has that physical makeup and solid base of like pro level traits that, even if he doesn't hit that top six potential, there's a really good chance you've got an NHL player there. And I think Minton has even kind of taken strides in his overall game this year. Obviously, he's got that lethal wrist shot. He's been doing a ton of damage on the power play for Kamloops this year. His role has kind of been up and down throughout the year, especially as Kamloops has loaded up as of late. They're going to take a run at the Memorial Cup. They're hosting it this year, but he's shown an ability to kind of adapt and find a way to make an impact playing different roles throughout their lineup this year. And I think he's just another guy who gives the Leafs system a little bit of a unique element in terms of that size, physicality, the ability to be strong on the puck and win those board battles and get things in the middle ice. And there's not a whole lot of projectable center depth in the organization. So to have a guy like Minton, I think it's definitely looking like a good pick so far.
And it's good to see these guys doing good because, again, you need the assets, you need the prospects to be able to make deals come deadline
Yeah.
time, and we'll see what Kyle Dubas can do in the next couple weeks, certainly. How about the two Finns, Niemela and Hervinen? How do they project? And, when do we see some of these guys potentially make that jump, obviously, to the AHL and to the NHL?
Well, I think we'll see both Niemela and Hervinen joining the Marlies later on this season, depending on how far their respective clubs go in the Liga playoffs.
Yeah.
Niemela, he exploded last year onto the scene. He had that massively productive year, one of the most productive U20 seasons by a defenseman in Liga history. And the numbers haven't quite been there the same way for him this year. But I think he's probably a player who lies somewhere in the middle of what we saw out of him last year production wise and what we've seen this year. The thing with Niemela is he's still doing all of the things to drive play for his team. Just a really smart player. I've always liked how proactive he was defensively, and he kind of added that element into the way he activates offensively last year, and that's what really helped him take that leap forward. But I think a lot of people maybe look at Niemela as that purely offensive defenseman, but if you think back to when the Leafs selected him, uh, director of amateur scouting at the time, John Lilly, was raving about his defensive instincts. They said this kid has maybe the best defensive instincts in the draft, and I think that has carried through so far the last couple of years in his Liga career, and he's just been able to kind of build on that and add that offensive element to his game. I'm really, really looking forward to seeing him make that transition to North America and join the Marlies later this year, kind of get his feet wet on the smaller ice surface, get used to the different angles and having less time and space. I think he's a player who is almost going to benefit from maybe a more difficult setting, in the sense that he thinks the game at such a high level that playing with other players like that, I think it's only going to be a good thing for him. He's probably a guy who's a couple of years away from, really pushing for an NHL job in earnest, but I don't think he's super far off of being kind of like an emergency call-up guy should injuries arise. For Hervinen, it's kind of been a similar thing for him this year. A bit of a step back offensively, but he's playing on a team who's really, really struggled to generate offense. So it's not entirely an individual thing for him when it comes to his production. But he's another player. He doesn't have the size and maybe that same physical makeup that Nyes or Minton do, but he does have a lot of those same pro level traits, able to play in the tight areas. He's a gritty little bugger. Maybe the skating could use a little bit of work, but he's really good in those small areas, delaying and using head fakes and stuff like that to draw defenders towards him. He's a guy who I think other teams will probably have some interest in these trade discussions coming up as kind of that B level prospect. I think Nyes is probably the only true A level prospect in the system, and I think obviously the Leafs are going to be hesitant to move on from him. So if they're looking to get any kind of business done, players like Niemela and Hervinen are probably going to come into the conversation.
And it hurts sometimes, honestly, when you see some of the kids get drafted, see how they do, and you want to see them in the show, but you also have to understand, too, that you have to trade some assets to get some good players back. Nick, before I let you go, now's your time to promote what's going on, anything with the podcast or over at the Leaf Station.
Just continuing to try and keep everyone up to date on the Leafs prospect system over at TLN. Every Monday, I put out a prospect roundup, trying to just kind of catch up on what each of the players in the system were up to over the last week, trends, if they're hot and cold, kind of what's going on with them. And yeah, it's been a ton of fun starting up the Lamenting the Leafs podcast with a couple of my best friends. It's a couple years now we've been doing it, and just really enjoying it. It's kind of a more relaxed look, just a couple of buddies sitting around kind of shooting the shit about the Leafs. I hope you'll check it out.
We will. Awesome stuff, dude. Thanks so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Nick. Cheers, buddy.
Anytime. That is Nick Richard over at TLN, does phenomenal prospect work. So make sure to check him out over on social media, and also the Lamenting the Leafs podcast. So appreciate his time as we get closer and closer to the trade deadline. There are going to be some names that we've just talked about that potentially could be involved in deals. Like Alex Steves is another guy who played a game the other night, obviously. Now sent back to the Marlies, but I think he could be a sneaky name to look for that could be on the move in terms of prospects between now and March 3rd. The wrap-up is brought to you by our friends over at PointsBet Canada. First and foremost, got to give some love and credit to Jay Rosehill for nailing another pick. The first time this season, he goes 2 for 2, 2 in a row. I know he got the Super Bowl pick on Friday as well, so he's feeling hot. I might put him back at the helm coming up tomorrow because he's shooting just fire right now. He had John Tavares over half an assist yesterday, and that hit. JT had 1-1, so well. And good job, Rosie. You killed it, buddy. So hopefully we'll have him back tomorrow in the mix for another bet. But I'm at duties today. I'm going to look at the Calgary-Detroit game. I like Tyler Toffoli over 2.5 shots on goal. I know the price is quite juiced at minus 160. But I think when you get the opportunity to make some money, you have to try and do it. And naturally, when I say that, he's going to miss, but I feel confident in the numbers and statistics behind it. He's cleared an 11 of 12, that 2.5 number. And on top of that, the Dubé, Lindholm, Toffoli line's been incredible lately for the Calgary Flames. And the Wings are on the back half of a back-to-back, which tells me fatigue could play a factor. I think Calgary wins that game. So Tyler Toffoli over 2.5 shots on goal in that game. As we wrap here, just looking at the chat, Rick writes in Meyer to Boston. I think from a Leafs perspective, that would really, really stink because the Bees are already a really good team. And if they add Meyer, that would suck. I think New Jersey's involved there. Obviously, Toronto could be involved in that conversation. Tim writes in, looking at maybe a draw in Seattle tonight. Tim would go to individual goal songs, so each guy has his own. I could not agree more, Tim. That's exactly what I would look at. And again, I look to prompt Jay Rosehill coming up tomorrow, but that goal song, if the players even care, you would have to think they do. But it's kind of stupid because like they have voiced in the past that they are willing to change the goal song, and nobody in the organization even cares. So it's like a moot point almost. Just to wrap as well, Tim writes, definitely looking at a Larkin prop against Calgary. He's just been tremendous. Dylan Larkin has 9 points in the last 5 games for the Detroit Red Wings. And by the sounds of it, could be closing in on a massive extension, could the captain of the Detroit Red Wings, and staying home there with the Red Wings. Prescott writes in Carolina by 2.5. That's a juice number, man. Like, especially against a sneaky team like Montreal, just playing really well. And then the other factor for me when looking at Carolina tonight is that they have the Stadium Series game coming up on Saturday. And to me, it just looks like the classic look-ahead game. So I'm probably staying away. Prescott, I'm happy you brought up Pierre-Luc Dubois. I'm looking at that. I love the revenge angle, as you all know. So Pierre-Luc Dubois, Patrick Laine, you want to maybe hit some anytime goals. Look at Rozovic as well. It's Columbus and Winnipeg tonight. And it sounds like Connor Hellebuck is healthy and good to go for the Winnipeg Jets. So we'll keep it at that. Many thanks to everybody for listening and writing in here on the YouTube chat. Fire as per usual. And again, Nick Richard just bringing the heat in terms of the prospect conversation. And Jay Rosehill, of course, another great installment of 3 Hits with Rosie. So we'll be back on Friday to tee up the back-to-back this weekend. On Saturday, hosting the Montreal Canadiens. On Sunday, visiting the Chicago Blackhawks, who they beat 5-2 last night. So without further ado, I bid you farewell. I'm Nick Alberga. Thanks so much for listening and watching. Take care.